The wind had teeth in this part of New Mexico. It bit and clawed, carrying a fine red dust that coated everything, filling the air with a gritty haze that tasted of iron and eternity. The sun was a merciless hammer in a bleached blue sky, beating down on the cracked earth and the skeletal remains of yucca plants. This was a land that offered no comfort, a place that stripped you down to bone and will. And Ellie Mae Thompson had precious little of either left. For 2 days, she had been a ghost, a fleeting shadow clinging to the underbelly of a world that didn't want her. Now, crouched in the corner of a rattling, swaying boxcar, she was just another piece of forgotten cargo. The splintered wooden floorboards dug into her knees, and the air was thick with the smell of old hay, coal smoke, and the faint, metallic scent of her own fear. Every clatter of the steel wheels on the track, every groan of the straining metal, was a fresh jolt to her frayed nerves. They were coming for her. She knew it with a certainty that was as cold and hard as the lump of dread in her stomach. She was 18 years old, an age that was supposed to signify the beginning of a life, not the desperate end of one, but her father, a man hollowed out by bad luck and worse whiskey, had seen her not as a daughter, but as a final, desperate wager. He hadn't sold her, not in the way one sold cattle, but the words he'd used felt just as damning. An arrangement. A binding agreement to settle a debt with Silas Blackwood, a man whose wealth was as vast as the plains and whose heart was as barren. Ellie had seen the way Blackwood looked at her. It wasn't with affection or even desire, but with the cool, appraising gaze of a collector examining a prized butterfly he was about to pin to a board. He saw her youth and spirit as things to be owned, to be tamed and put on display in his grand, empty house. The thought of his touch, of his quiet, suffocating possession, was a horror worse than any physical threat. So she had run, with a small canvas bag containing a loaf of bread, her mother's tarnished silver locket, and a handful of coins. She had slipped out of her home under the cloak of a moonless night and scrambled aboard the first westbound freight train she could find. Her hiding spot was in the last car, a cavernous space mostly empty save for a few scattered crates and the ever-present dust that danced in the slivers of light piercing through the gaps in the walls. For hours, she had been alone with the rhythmic thunder of the journey, but as the sun had begun its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, she realized she was not. He was in the far corner, a long, lean shape folded into the shadows. At first, she thought he was just a trick of the light, a denser patch of darkness. But then he shifted, the slight movement of a shoulder, the tilt of a head, and her heart seized in her chest. He had been there the whole time, as silent and still as the landscape outside. Slowly, her eyes adjusted, and she made out the details. He was tall, even sitting down, with broad shoulders that strained the seams of a worn, dusty shirt. A wide-brimmed hat, stained with sweat and time, was pulled low, obscuring most of his face, but she could see the hard line of his jaw, covered in a dark stubble, and the way his long legs were stretched out, ending in boots that were scuffed, scarred, and coated in the same red earth as everything else. His hands rested on his knees, large and calloused, the hands of a man who spoke through work, not words. He seemed less like a person and more like something carved from the tough, unyielding land itself. He hadn't looked at her. His gaze seemed fixed on some point beyond the rattling walls of the train, as if he were watching a horizon only he could see. There was a profound stillness about him, a quiet that felt ancient and deep. It wasn't the quiet of peace, but the quiet of exhaustion, of a soul that had seen too much and felt too much and had now settled into a state of weary acceptance. Fear, sharp and acidic, rose in Ellie's throat. A lone woman on a train with a strange man was a story that rarely ended well. Every instinct screamed at her to make herself smaller, to disappear back into the shadows. She pressed herself against the rough wall, trying to control the ragged, panicked rhythm of her breathing. But then she heard it. It wasn't a sound from the train. It was the sound of voices, men's voices, carried on the wind from further up the line. The train was slowing, its rhythmic clatter descending into a laborious, screeching groan as it approached a water stop. The voices grew louder, rough and impatient, and among them, she heard a name, Blackwood. Ice flooded her veins. They hadn't given up. Of course they hadn't. Silas Blackwood was not a man who tolerated losing what he considered his... Panic was a wild animal clawing at the inside of her chest. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The boxcar was a trap. The men would board. They would search every car, and they would find her. Her desperate flight would end here, in the dust and the gloom, and she would be dragged back to a fate she could not bear to imagine. Her terrified gaze darted around the car and landed, once again, on the silent man in the corner. He was still unmoving, seemingly oblivious to the approaching danger. He was a stranger, a risk, a potential threat in his own right, but he was also her only chance, however slim. Scrambling to her feet, her legs unsteady, she moved toward him. The floorboards creaked under her light weight, but he gave no sign that he heard. He didn't look up until she was standing a few feet away, a trembling silhouette against the fading light. When he finally lifted his head, she saw his eyes. They were the color of a winter sky just before a storm, a deep, clouded gray that held no warmth, only a vast, tired emptiness. They were the eyes of a man who had lost things, people, dreams, faith. They looked at her not with curiosity or suspicion, but with a flat, weary resignation, as if her sudden, desperate appearance was just one more sorrow in a world full of them. This was Wade Kerrigan. Though she didn't know his name, all she saw was a man who looked like he had nothing left to lose. And, in a strange way, that gave her a sliver of hope. "Please," she whispered, her voice a dry, cracking thing. "Please, sir." He didn't speak. He just watched her, his expression unreadable. The train shuddered to a final, groaning halt. The heavy thud of boots hitting the gravel outside was unmistakable now. They were close, so close. Tears of pure terror welled in Ellie's eyes. "They're looking for me," she choked out, the words tumbling over each other in her haste. "You have to hide me, please." She expected questions. She expected a refusal, a suspicious glare, or worse, a cruel laugh. She expected him to demand payment or to turn her over himself. 100 terrible possibilities flashed through her mind. Wade Kerrigan did none of those things. His gray eyes held hers for a long, silent moment. He saw the genuine, gut-wrenching fear etched on her young face, the way her whole body trembled like a leaf in a storm. He saw the torn hem of her dress and the smudge of dirt on her cheek. He saw not a problem or an opportunity, but a creature caught in a snare, desperate for any chance of escape. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of wounded animals and broken men. Without a word, without changing his impassive expression, he reached out, not for her, but for the edge of the heavy canvas duster coat that lay beside him. He lifted the flap, creating a small, dark space between his body and the wall of the train car. It was an invitation, a silent, unasked-for act of grace. Ellie didn't hesitate. She scrambled into the space, curling herself into a tight ball at his side. The heavy fabric of the coat fell over her, plunging her into a world of near-total darkness. The air was close, smelling of dust, leather, and something else, the faint, clean scent of wood smoke that clung to the man himself. She was pressed against the solid warmth of his body, the rough texture of his shirt, a strange, grounding reality in her swirling panic. Beneath her ear, she could feel the slow, steady, unhurried beat of his heart. It was the calmest thing she had felt in days. The boxcar door slid open with a deafening shriek of metal on metal, flooding the space with the harsh, bright light of the setting sun. Ellie squeezed her eyes shut, holding her breath. certain her own frantic heartbeat was loud enough to betray her. "Check this one," a gruff voice commanded from the doorway. Heavy footsteps entered the car. She could hear the men moving around, kicking at the scattered crates, their voices echoing in the enclosed space. "Nothing in here but a half-asleep cowpoke," a second voice grumbled. "Closer now. Don't look like he's got 2 cents to rub together, let alone a runaway girl." Ellie felt the man beside her, Wade, shift ever so slightly, a subtle movement that settled the coat more firmly around her. He was a mountain of stillness, a formidable, uninteresting shadow in the corner. From the outside, he must have looked like just another drifter, worn down by the road, a man not worth a second glance. "You there," the first voice barked, the sound sharp and right next to them. "You seen a girl about 18, brown hair, scared rabbit eyes." Ellie's blood ran cold. She waited for the man beside her to speak, to give her away. A single word from him, and it would all be over. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. She could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the pursuer's impatient stare. Then, from the man beside her, came a low, gravelly sound, more of a rustle in the throat than a word. No. It was the first time she had heard his voice. It was deep and rough, like stones grinding together. The voice of a man who used it so seldom it had gathered rust. But it was firm, final. There was no room for argument in that single, hard syllable. There was a moment of grumbling, a muttered curse. "Waste of time. Come on, let's check the next car before this thing starts moving again." The footsteps receded. The blinding rectangle of light was blocked out as the heavy door slammed shut, plunging the car back into dusty twilight. A few moments later, a loud whistle blew, and with a violent jolt that threw Ellie against the man's side, the train began to move again. The slow, rhythmic clatter of the wheels resumed, carrying them away from the water stop, away from the immediate danger. But she didn't move. She stayed curled in her dark, safe space, listening to the steady, reassuring beat of the stranger's heart. He had hidden her. He had lied for her. He had asked for nothing in return. In the harsh, unforgiving landscape of the West, where trust was a currency scarcer than water, this silent, weary-eyed cowboy had simply lifted the edge of his coat, and under the cover of dust and fear, a fragile, unspoken alliance had been forged. For a long time after the train lurched back into motion, Ellie remained tucked under the heavy canvas of Wade Kerrigan's coat. The space was dark and confining, but it was the only safety she had known in days. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels was a lullaby of escape, and the slow, steady beat of the man's heart beside her was a drum of reassurance. Hope, a fragile and unfamiliar feeling, began to flicker within her. Maybe she had made it. Maybe they had given up. The illusion shattered with a jarring crash from the front of the car. It wasn't the sound of shifting cargo. It was the splintering of wood, the violent impact of a boot against the connecting door. The hope in Ellie's chest died instantly, replaced by a cold, familiar dread. Wade's entire body tensed. It was a subtle shift, a tightening of muscle that she felt through the thin fabric of her dress. But it was as clear as a shouted warning. He didn't need to say a word. He knew, as she did, that their brief respite was over. His arm, which had been resting loosely near her, moved with quiet purpose, pressing her more firmly against his side, tucking her deeper into the shadows. The broken door was thrown open, and 3 figures silhouetted themselves against the light from the next car. They were not the same men who had briefly checked the car at the water stop. These were the men Silas Blackwood would send when a simple search failed. They moved with a predatory confidence, their eyes scanning the dark corners with a practiced efficiency. The leader, a lean man with a cruel twist to his mouth named Finn, stepped fully into the car. He wore a dusty bowler hat and a vest that couldn't conceal the handle of the pistol tucked into his belt. His gaze was sharp and intelligent, missing nothing. Flanking him were 2 others. One was a hulking brute of a man, Jeb, whose knuckles were scarred and swollen. The other, Roscoe, was wiry and nervous, his eyes darting back and forth like a cornered coyote. "Told you they missed one," Finn said, his voice smooth but edged with menace. He took a slow step forward, his boots crunching on the dusty floor. "Blackwood wants his property back, and he ain't particular about the condition." Ellie's breath hitched. She felt Wade's hand find her shoulder, a silent command to stay absolutely still. The pressure was firm, grounding her even as her mind threatened to spiral into panic. Jeb pointed a thick finger toward the corner. "What's that?" "Finn, just a drifter sleeping it off." Finn's cold eyes narrowed on the shape of Wade Kerrigan. He was not as easily dismissed as the previous searchers. He saw not just a sleeping man, but a large man, a potentially capable man, deliberately making himself uninteresting. "Maybe," Finn said softly, walking closer. "Or maybe he's got a real warm blanket." He stopped just a few feet away. Ellie could smell the stale whiskey on his breath even from her hiding place. She pressed her face into the rough fabric of Wade's shirt, praying to become invisible, to melt into his shadow. Wade remained as still as stone, his breathing even, giving away nothing. He was a rock, and she was the frightened creature hiding behind it. "Hey, Cowboy." Finn's voice was dangerously pleasant. "Wake up. We need to have a look under that coat." He nudged Wade's outstretched boot with his own. There was no response. Wade didn't move a muscle. Roscoe giggled. "A high, nervous sound. Maybe he's dead." "He ain't dead," Finn said, his patience wearing thin. He reached down, his hand closing on the collar of Wade's duster. "Last chance, friend. Move, or we move you." In that instant, everything changed. The moment Finn's fingers touched the coat, the stillness in Wade shattered. He moved with a speed that was shocking in a man his size. It wasn't an attack, but an explosion of pure, desperate motion. His arm clamped around Ellie like a steel band, lifting her with him as he surged to his feet in one fluid movement. The coat fell away. For a split second, Ellie was exposed, her wide, terrified eyes meeting Finn's astonished gaze. The man's look of surprise morphed into a snarl of triumph. "There she is." But Wade didn't give them a chance to react. He was already turning, pulling her with him, his body shielding hers from the three men. He took 2 powerful strides toward the side of the boxcar, toward the heavy, sliding door. The train was picking up speed now, the landscape outside a streaking blur of ochre and gray. "Stop them!" Finn bellowed. Jeb lunged, his big hands reaching for them. Wade didn't even look back. With a powerful shove of his shoulder, he slammed into the heavy door. It screeched open a few feet, revealing the dizzying motion of the ground below. A torrent of rock and scrub rushing past. The wind roared into the car, a physical force that tore at their clothes and hair. Ellie screamed, a thin thread of sound lost in the thunder of the train and the wind. They were trapped. The open door wasn't an escape. It was a sheer drop into certain death. But Wade didn't hesitate. He held her tight, his head bent close to her ear. His voice, when it came, was not a shout, but a low, urgent command that cut through the chaos. "Hold on to me. Don't let go." She didn't have time to think, to argue, to be afraid. She just reacted, her arms wrapping around his neck, her fingers digging into the thick muscle of his shoulders. She buried her face against his chest, her world shrinking to the solid feel of him, the scent of dust and smoke, the impossible choice he was about to make for both of them. He took one more step, to the very edge of the abyss. Then, as Jeb's hand brushed his back, he jumped, pulling her with him out into the roaring void. The fall was a heart-stopping moment of weightlessness. The world turned upside down, a chaotic swirl of blue sky and red earth. Then they hit the ground. The impact was brutal. It knocked the air from her lungs in a painful gasp. They didn't just land, they tumbled, a tangle of limbs rolling over and over down a steep, gravelly embankment. Rocks scraped at her skin. Thorns tore at her dress. Her head hit something hard, and for a moment, the world dissolved into a constellation of bright, flashing stars. The momentum finally slowed, and they came to a stop in a cloud of dust at the bottom of a dry wash. For a few seconds, there was only pain. Every part of her body ached. Her side was on fire where she'd landed. Her hands were raw, and her head throbbed with a dull, sickening pulse. She coughed, the dust in her throat making her retch. Then she felt a hand on her arm, strong and insistent. "Get up!" Wade's voice was strained, but it was still a command. "We have to move, now!" She opened her eyes. He was already on his feet, pulling her up. His face was grim, streaked with dirt, and a thin line of blood trickled from a cut on his temple. But his gray eyes were clear and focused, scanning the top of the embankment where they had fallen. The train was already receding in the distance, its whistle a faint, lonely cry. "I can't," she whimpered, her ankles screaming in protest as she tried to put weight on it. "You have to," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He didn't offer sympathy or comfort, only the hard necessity of survival. He looped one of her arms over his shoulder, taking most of her weight, and half-dragged, half-carried her forward. "They'll stop the train. They'll come back for us." And so began the flight. It was a desperate, agonizing scramble through a landscape designed to kill. The sun beat down on them, and the air was scorching. They moved through narrow, winding ravines, the rock walls radiating heat like an oven. Thorny branches of mesquite and catclaw acacia reached out to tear at them. The ground was a treacherous mix of loose rock and soft sand, making every step a struggle. Ellie's world narrowed to the simple, torturous act of putting one foot in front of the other. Her lungs burned, her muscles screamed, and the pain in her ankle was a constant, throbbing agony. Tears of pain and exhaustion streamed down her dusty cheeks, but she didn't make a sound. She knew that any sign of weakness would only slow them down, and slowing down meant capture. Through it all, Wade was a relentless, unstoppable force. He moved with an economy of motion, his eyes constantly scanning the terrain ahead, choosing the path of most resistance for their pursuers but of easiest passage for them. He never spoke, except for the occasional one-word command. "Here. Wait. Low." His silence was not empty. It was filled with a fierce concentration. He was reading the land like a book he had known his whole life. He led her across stretches of bare rock that would hold no footprints, through thickets of brush that would obscure their passage. He was a part of this harsh world. And, for the first time, Ellie understood that the quiet, weary man from the boxcar was more than he appeared. He was a survivor. After what felt like an eternity, he finally pulled her into the deep shadow of a rock outcropping. "Stay here. Don't move," he commanded, gently lowering her to the ground. Her legs gave out, and she slumped against the rock, panting. He was already moving again, his eyes scanning the dry creek bed. He found what he was looking for, a dense clump of dead, tinder-dry greasewood, working with a speed and precision that mesmerized her. He pulled a small flint and steel from a pouch on his belt. He gathered a handful of the driest leaves, struck the steel, and a tiny spark bloomed into a small, fragile flame. He didn't build a fire for warmth or comfort. He carefully fed it the greenest, most resinous parts of the brush he could find. A thick, oily black smoke began to pour from the small blaze. The ravine they were in acted as a funnel, and the wind, which he had clearly been observing, caught the plume of smoke and carried it eastward, up and out of the wash, toward a distant mountain pass. It was a perfect misdirection, a clear signal that pointed in the exact opposite direction of their intended path. Anyone following would see the smoke and assume they were making for the mountains. He smothered the flames with sand just as quickly as he had started them, leaving no trace of a fire. Only the lingering smell of smoke and a signal sent to fool their enemies. He came back to her side, his face an unreadable mask of grim determination. He offered her a canteen. "Drink. Not too much." She took it with trembling hands, the water cool and life-giving in her parched throat. She looked at him, at the blood drying on his temple, at the focused intensity in his storm-gray eyes. He had asked for nothing, promised nothing. He didn't even know her name. Yet he had thrown himself from a moving train and was now leading her through this unforgiving wilderness, putting his own life in jeopardy for a complete stranger. Panic still fluttered in her chest, a caged and desperate bird. She was hurt, exhausted, and hunted. But as she watched him survey the ridgeline, his profile as hard and timeless as the rocks around them, a new feeling began to take root beside the fear. It was a profound and overwhelming sense of awe. He hadn't said, "I will protect you." He was simply doing it, in a world where promises were as cheap and brittle as dried leaves. Wade Kerrigan's actions were as solid and real as the ground beneath her feet. He hadn't left her behind, and in that desolate, sun-scorched ravine, that was the only promise that mattered. The smoke signal was a fading memory, a ghostly plume swallowed by the vast, indifferent sky. Wade allowed them no rest. He pushed them onward, away from the path he had feigned, leading them deeper into a labyrinth of canyons and rock formations that grew more imposing as the sun bled toward the horizon. The world turned into a dramatic landscape of deep shadows and brilliant, fiery highlights on the high mesas. Ellie's pain had subsided into a dull, persistent ache, a rhythm that matched her ragged breathing and the thud of her worn-out shoes on the hard-packed earth. Her trust in the silent man guiding her was absolute, born not of words but of a shared, desperate flight. He moved with a knowledge of the land that was as instinctive as breathing. He was no longer just a man. He was a guide, a protector, her only anchor in a world that had come completely undone. When the last light of day failed, and a blanket of impossible stars was thrown across the blackness, he did not stop. He navigated by the shape of the ridgelines against the starlight, his hand on her arm, a steady, unwavering pressure in the dark. Just when Ellie was certain she could not take another step, that her legs would fold and leave her in a heap on the ground, she felt a change in the air. The dry, dusty heat of the desert gave way to a cooler breeze that carried the scent of pine and damp earth. The ground beneath their feet softened, and the sound of their passage was muffled by a carpet of fallen needles. Wade led her through a final, narrow fissure in a towering wall of rock, a passage so tight their shoulders brushed the cold stone on either side. They emerged from the darkness of the passage into a small valley bathed in moonlight. It was like stepping into another world. The oppressive, hostile grandeur of the desert was gone, replaced by a sanctuary, a small, clear creek, its water glittering like a silver ribbon under the moon, snaked its way through a meadow of tall grass, a stand of cottonwood trees, their leaves whispering in the gentle breeze, lined the bank. The valley was cupped on all sides by sheer cliffs of dark rock, a natural fortress that sealed it off from the outside world. It was a secret place, a haven hidden in the heart of the unforgiving wilderness. And in the center of the meadow, nestled beside the creek, stood a small cabin. It was not a large or an imposing structure. It was built of thick, hand-hewn logs, the gaps chinked with mud and straw. A stone chimney rose from one side, solid and sturdy. A soft yellow light glowed from a single window, a beacon of warmth in the cool darkness. A simple porch ran the length of the front, and next to it, a neat stack of firewood stood almost as tall as a man. A small corral, its fence posts straight and strong, held two horses that lifted their heads and nickered softly at their approach. This place was not an accident. It was the work of a man who had sought not just shelter, but solitude. Every log, every stone, every nail seemed to have been placed with deliberate, painstaking care. It was a fortress built against the harshness of the land and, Ellie suspected, the cruelty of men. This was Wade Kerrigan's home, the place he had retreated to after the world had left its scars on him. The weary emptiness in his eyes suddenly made a new kind of sense. It was the look of a man who had fought a war and had come here to find peace. As they drew closer, the cabin door opened, spilling a rectangle of warm light onto the porch. A small figure appeared, no taller than Ellie's waist. It was a boy. He stood perfectly still, watching them approach, a miniature sentinel in a too large shirt. He had a thatch of unruly dark hair and a small, serious face. In the dim light, his eyes looked enormous, dark pools of watchfulness. He couldn't have been more than 6 years old. Wade did not call out a greeting. He simply walked up the porch steps, Ellie still leaning on him, and stopped in front of the child. The boy's gaze shifted from Wade to Ellie, taking in her torn dress, her scratched face, and her exhausted, fearful expression. There was no judgment in his eyes, only a quiet, solemn curiosity. "Boone," Wade said. His voice, in the stillness of the valley, was low and soft, stripped of the hard edge it had held in the ravine. The boy, Boone, looked up at him. He didn't speak, but gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a greeting, an acknowledgement, an entire conversation contained in a single, silent gesture. It spoke of a deep, familiar comfort between the two of them, a bond forged in a shared quiet. Wade guided Ellie inside. The interior of the cabin was a single room, but it was clean and orderly. A simple rope bed was built into one corner, a rough wool blanket folded neatly on top. A sturdy wooden table and 2 chairs stood near the stone hearth, where a small fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. A few cast-iron pots hung from hooks by the fireplace. There was a sparse, masculine tidiness to the place. It was the home of a man who owned little but took care of what he had. Wade led her to one of the chairs and gently eased her into it. For the first time since he had pulled her from the train, he let go of her. The absence of his supporting weight made her feel strangely adrift. He turned to the boy, who had followed them inside and was now standing silently by the door. "Water," Wade said quietly. Boone nodded again and went to a wooden bucket in the corner. Scooping a dipper full of water into a tin cup, he brought it to Ellie, holding it out with both small hands. His movements were careful, deliberate, as if he were handling something precious. Ellie took the cup, her fingers brushing his. His hands were small and cool. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Boone just looked at her with those big, serious eyes before retreating to stand near the fireplace, a small, silent shadow watching everything. While she drank, Wade moved to the hearth. He took a small pot from a hook, filled it with water from the bucket, and set it near the fire to warm. He then opened a small cupboard, taking out a clean rag and a small jar of dark, pungent salve. He did all this without a word, his movements efficient and purposeful. He knelt in front of her and gently took her injured ankle in his large, calloused hands. She flinched, expecting a jolt of pain, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. With slow, careful movements, he untied the lace of her ruined shoe and eased it off her swollen foot. He soaked the rag in the warm water and began to clean away the dirt and dried blood from the cuts and scrapes. Ellie sat frozen, watching him. This man, this stranger who had fought for her and saved her, was now kneeling at her feet, tending to her injuries with the quiet focus of a physician. The silence in the cabin was broken only by the crackle of the fire and the soft sound of the wet cloth on her skin. In that moment, something inside her that had been coiled into a tight, hard knot of fear for days began to slowly, cautiously, unwind. She looked from Wade's bowed head, his dark hair falling over his brow as he concentrated on his task, to the small boy standing by the fire. Boone had not taken his eyes off them. He watched with an unnerving stillness, his expression unreadable. She realized then that Boone was a refugee, just like her. Wade had taken him in, too, given him shelter from a world that had left him homeless. A man who would do that, who would create a safe harbor for a lost child, was not a man to be feared. When Wade finished cleaning her wounds, he opened the jar of salve, The scent of pine and herbs filled the air. He applied it to her ankle with the same gentle precision, his rough fingers surprisingly deft. He then tore a strip from another clean rag and bound her ankle, his work neat and firm. "It's a sprain," he said, his first full sentence to her since they had jumped from the train. "Need to stay off it for a few days." He stood up, his gaze meeting hers for a brief moment. His gray eyes were tired, but the hard, empty look was softened by the firelight. He looked away almost immediately, as if direct eye contact was something he could no longer sustain. He gestured to the rope bed in the corner. "You take the bed." "Where will you sleep?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Floor is fine," he said, and the finality in his tone made it clear there was no room for argument. He and Boone would take blankets by the fire. He turned and dished out 3 bowls of a simple stew that had been simmering by the hearth. He handed one to her, one to Boone, and took the last for himself. They ate in silence. The stew was thin, mostly potatoes and a little salt meat, but to Ellie, it was the most wonderful meal she had ever tasted. It was warm and nourishing, and it was safe. That was the word that echoed in her mind. Safe. It was a feeling so alien, so long absent, that she could barely identify it at first. It was the absence of fear. It was the solid log walls of the cabin, the warmth of the fire, the quiet presence of the man and the boy. It was the knowledge that the cliffs outside formed an impenetrable barrier, and that the men hunting her would never find this hidden place. For the first time since she had overheard her father's terrible bargain, the frantic, hunted animal inside of her grew still. After they ate, Wade took the empty bowls. Boone, without being told, picked up a few small logs from the wood box and placed them carefully on the fire. A silent, shared routine. Ellie watched them, feeling like a ghost, an intruder in their quiet world. She didn't belong here, but she had nowhere else to go. A wave of uselessness washed over her. She couldn't just be a burden. The next morning, she woke to the smell of wood smoke and the quiet sounds of the 2 of them moving about the cabin. Her ankle throbbed, but she pushed herself up. Wade was outside, tending to the horses. Boone was sitting at the table, meticulously carving a small piece of wood with a dull knife, feeling clumsy and conspicuous. Ellie limped to the hearth. The fire was low, and the kindling box was nearly empty. Without a thought, she opened the cabin door and stepped outside into the crisp morning air. The sun was just cresting the eastern cliffs, flooding the valley with golden light. She took a deep breath. The air was clean and sharp. She began to gather fallen twigs and small branches, her movements slow and careful, and carried them back inside to fill the box. When she finished, she noticed the water bucket was low. She took it and limped down to the creek, the cold, clear water a shock to her senses. Back in the cabin, she saw that the simple table was dusty. She found a rag, dampened it, and wiped it clean. They were small tasks, insignificant gestures, but for Ellie, they were everything. They were an attempt to reclaim a piece of herself, to be more than just the girl who was running. It was her silent way of contributing, of earning her keep, of saying thank you. She swept the floor with a handmade broom. She tried to organize the few pans by the fire. Through it all, Boone watched her, his carving forgotten in his lap. Wade came back inside, saw what she was doing, and said nothing. He simply accepted her presence, her small contributions. His silence was not an absence of feeling. It was a space she could occupy without question, without expectation. That afternoon, as she sat on the porch, resting her ankle and watching Boone try to skip stones across the creek, the feeling returned. Stronger this time, the feeling of safety. It was in the solid feel of the wooden porch beneath her, in the gentle whisper of the cottonwood leaves, in the watchful silence of the valley. This was a place where no one would find her. A haven built by a broken man and shared with a lost boy. And for now, against all odds, it was home. The days in the hidden valley settled into a rhythm, as quiet and steady as the creek that flowed through its heart. Time, which had been a frantic, breathless race for survival, slowed to a gentle, meandering pace. Ellie's ankle healed, the sharp pain dulling to a tender ache. And with each passing day, a deeper healing took place within her spirit. The constant, thrumming terror that had been her companion for so long began to recede, replaced by the tranquil sounds of her new reality, the whisper of wind in the cottonwoods, the soft nicker of the horses in the corral, the distant, rhythmic ring of Wade's axe as he split firewood. She learned the contours of their quiet life. Mornings began with the smell of wood smoke and chicory. Wade would already be up and gone by the time the sun cleared the cliffs, moving with a silent purpose to the endless tasks that his small homestead demanded. He was a man in constant, deliberate motion, mending a fence line, clearing stones from a small patch of earth he hoped to turn into a garden, currying the horses until their coats shone. He moved with a deep, weary competence, a man who had made a pact with the land to be left alone in exchange for his unending labor. In the beginning, Ellie felt like a ghost haunting the edges of this life. She was a guest with no invitation and no clear departure date. But her nature was not to be idle. As her ankles strengthened, she claimed the small cabin as her domain. It was a silent, unspoken negotiation. She found a rhythm in sweeping the floorboards, in scrubbing the cast-iron skillet with sand from the creek, in kneading a passable dough from their meager supply of flour. She learned to bank the fire at night so a bed of hot coals would be waiting in the morning. She mended Boone's worn shirts with clumsy but determined stitches, her needle a small, shining weapon against the slow decay of their world. Boone was the bridge. In the beginning, he was as silent as Wade, a small shadow who watched her with his big, solemn eyes. He seemed to be waiting for her to disappear, as other things in his short life likely had. But Ellie's quiet persistence, her gentle presence, slowly chipped away at his reserve. She never pushed, never demanded his attention. She simply was there, a calm and steady fixture in his day. The breakthrough came one afternoon over a piece of frayed rope. Wade had tasked Boone with mending a lead line, but the boy's small fingers were struggling with the thick, stubborn fibers. He was growing frustrated, his brow furrowed in concentration. Ellie, sitting on the porch steps darning a sock, watched him for a moment before speaking. "It's easier if you braid it," she said softly. Boone looked up, his expression wary. "Here, let me show you," she said, setting her sewing aside. She took a few strands of discarded twine and, with practiced movements, began to weave them together. "My mother taught me. She said a good braid is stronger than a single rope, because everything holds everything else up." She worked slowly, demonstrating how to cross one strand over the other in a simple, repeating pattern. Boone crept closer, his eyes fixed on her hands. She took his small hands in hers and guided him through the motions. His fingers were clumsy at first, the twine slipping and tangling, but she was patient. "Just like that," she murmured, one over the other. "See, it's like a dance." They sat like that for nearly an hour, the silence broken only by her soft instructions. Wade had returned to the corral to fix a loose rail, and from the corner of her eye, Ellie could see him. He wasn't looking at them, not directly, but his work had slowed. He would hammer a nail, then pause, his head slightly turned, listening. He was a quiet observer, a silent guardian watching this small, fragile piece unfold on his porch. Finally, Boone got it. A small, neat braid began to form under his fingers. A look of profound, wondrous pride spread across his small face. It wasn't a smile. Not yet, but the solemn mask had cracked. He held up his creation for her to see. "That's it," Ellie said, her own smile genuine and warm. "You did it." A few days later, Boone returned the favor. Ellie was down by the creek, watching the water skitter over the smooth, gray stones. Boone was beside her, chewing on a broad blade of grass. Suddenly, a high, piercing whistle cut through the air. Ellie jumped, looking around. It was Boone. He held the blade of grass between his thumbs and blew again, producing another clear, sweet note. He saw her look of astonishment and, for the first time, a shy grin touched his lips. He pulled another blade of grass and held it out to her. "Like this," he said, his voice a little rusty from disuse. He showed her how to hold it taut between her knuckles, how to purse her lips just so. Ellie tried, producing only a soft, breathy hiss. She tried again and again, feeling foolish, her cheeks puffing out. Boone didn't laugh. He watched with the serious concentration of a master craftsman instructing an apprentice. He adjusted the position of her thumbs, pointed to the exact spot on the grass. "Tighter," he instructed. "Blow hard." She took a deep breath, held the grass just as he'd shown her, and blew. A wavering, but distinct, whistle emerged. It was a clumsy sound, nothing like his clear, bird-like call. But it was a note. She looked at Boone, her eyes wide with surprise, and laughed. The sound of her own laughter felt strange and wonderful. A forgotten language. Boone's shy grin widened, and this time, he laughed too. A small, delightful chuckle that was all the more precious for its rarity. Wade was standing by the woodpile, axe in hand. He was watching them, and this time, he didn't look away when she caught his eye. For a fleeting second, the hard, weary lines around his mouth softened. It was the barest ghost of a smile, a flicker of warmth in his stormy gray eyes. But it was there. It was an acknowledgement, a silent approval. In that moment, the cabin felt less like his refuge and more like their home. The valley was waking up to spring. Patches of stubborn wildflowers began to appear, pushing their way through the hard soil, their vibrant colors a startling contrast to the muted tones of the rock and dust. One afternoon, while exploring a little farther up the creek than she had gone before, Ellie found a small patch of bluebells growing in the shelter of a large boulder. They were a deep, impossible shade of blue, delicate and yet resilient, thriving in a place they had no right to be. They reminded her of the hope that was beginning to grow in her own heart, a fragile, unexpected bloom in the barren landscape of her life. On impulse, she picked a single, perfect stalk. She carried it back to the cabin, its vibrant color a secret joy held in her hand. She didn't know what to do with it. Giving it to Wade felt too forward, too personal. It was a gesture that belonged to a different world, one with words and easy affections. So she simply left it on the rough-hewn sill of the window by the door, its blue head a small, bright prayer against the weathered gray wood. She didn't mention it. No one did. Wade must have seen it when he came in for the evening meal, but his expression gave nothing away. He was as quiet and distant as ever. A part of Ellie felt foolish, childish. It was just a flower. By morning, it would be wilted and forgotten. That night, Ellie couldn't sleep. The cabin was filled with the soft, rhythmic breathing of Wade and Boone, asleep in their bedrolls by the hearth. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a faint, reddish glow on the log walls. She was restless, her mind filled with a jumble of thoughts and feelings she couldn't name. She slipped out of the bed, her bare feet silent on the cool floorboards, and went to the window to look at the stars. As she passed the main room, a slight movement near the hearth caught her eye. She stopped, pressing herself into the shadows. Wade was not asleep. He was sitting up, his back to her, silhouetted against the dying embers. In the faint light, she could see that he was holding something. It was the small, wilting bluebell. He held it with a strange reverence, his large, calloused fingers surprisingly gentle. He looked at it for a long time, as if it held the answer to some profound, unasked question. Then he reached for a small, leather-bound book that she had seen on the mantelpiece but had assumed was a Bible or a ledger. It was worn with age, the cover softened and scarred. He opened it to a page near the middle. It was not a printed book. The pages were filled with a dense, slightly slanted handwriting. A journal. His journal. With infinite care. Wade placed the single bluebell onto the open page. He gently closed the book, pressing the flower between the leaves, preserving its fleeting beauty within the secret history of his life. He held the closed journal in his hands for a moment longer before placing it carefully back on the mantelpiece. Then, he lay back down on his bedroll and pulled the blanket over his shoulder. His back once again a silent, unmoving wall. Ellie stood frozen in the shadows, her heart hammering against her ribs. He hadn't thrown it away. He had saved it. He had taken her small, unspoken gesture and tucked it away, given it a place of permanence in his closed-off world. No words had been spoken, no promises had been made, but in the quiet darkness of the cabin, with the scent of wood smoke in the air, she knew with absolute certainty that something real and true was growing in this hidden valley. It was growing as silently and as persistently as a wildflower in the desert, a quiet, stubborn bloom in the space between two wounded, wary souls. The memory of the wildflower, pressed and preserved in the pages of Wade's journal, became a secret Ellie held close to her heart. It was a silent promise, an unspoken acknowledgement that her presence in this valley was not just an accident of circumstance, but something that mattered. From that night on, the quiet between them began to change. It was no longer an empty space defined by the absence of words, but a vessel filled with a new, unspoken language. It was a language of gestures, a conversation held in the space between a glance and a helping hand, and they were both becoming fluent. Words, Ellie realized, were for people whose lives had not been broken by them. Her father's promises had been empty, whiskey-soaked lies. Silas Blackwood's words had been threats veiled in the language of ownership. For Wade, she suspected words were tied to a past so painful he had walled it off completely. Words could deceive, they could wound, they could fail. But actions, small and deliberate, had a truth to them that could not be denied. An action was a fact. It was real. Her favorite place in the valley was a large, flat slab of granite that rested beside the creek, warmed by the afternoon sun. It was her sanctuary within a sanctuary. She would go there to mend shirts, to watch the water flow, to simply sit and let the quiet of the valley seep into her bones and wash away the last vestiges of fear. The rock was smooth from centuries of rushing water, and from her perch, she could see the whole of their small world, the sturdy cabin, the corral where the horses flicked their tails in the sun, and Boone, a small figure perpetually engaged in some serious, boyish enterprise. One afternoon, she went to her rock with a shirt of Boone's that needed a new button. As she approached, she saw something resting on the stone, something that had not been there that morning. It was a cup. It was made of wood, likely from a fallen branch of one of the cottonwood trees that lined the creek. It had been carved with painstaking care. The outside sanded so smooth it felt like polished stone under her fingertips. It was sized perfectly to fit a woman's hand, smaller and more delicate than the heavy tin cups they used in the cabin. The grain of the wood swirled in beautiful, pale patterns, and the rim was perfectly rounded and smooth. It was a simple object, but it was perfect. There was no name carved into it, no note left beside it. There was no need. Ellie knew, with a certainty that went deeper than logic, that it was from Wade. She had seen him in the evenings, sitting on the porch with Boone, showing the boy how to carve small animals from scraps of wood. She had seen the patient, focused look in his eyes, the way his large, rough hands could perform such delicate work. This cup was a product of that same quiet skill, of hours of his time, of his focused attention. She lifted it. It was light and cool to the touch. She traced the rim with her finger, her heart swelling with an emotion so powerful it made her throat ache. This cup was more than a gift. It was a statement. He had seen her, truly seen her. He had noticed her daily ritual of going to the rock. He had seen her scoop water from the creek with her cupped hands. And in his silent, solitary way, he had decided to make something for her, to ease that small, insignificant part of her day. He was telling her, without a single word, that she belonged here, that this place, her place by the creek, was now officially hers. She pressed the cup to her cheek, the smooth wood a comfort against her skin. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of a profound, overwhelming gratitude. This was the first beautiful thing anyone had ever given her. It was the first thing that was wholly and completely hers. Not a hand-me-down, not a cast-off, but something created just for her. She did not thank him when he returned to the cabin that evening. The words felt clumsy and inadequate, a crude tool for such a delicate feeling. Instead, when she served the stew, she filled the new wooden cup with fresh, cool water from the bucket and placed it by his plate. It was her own silent acknowledgement, her own way of completing the conversation. He glanced at the cup, then at her, and for a moment, their eyes met across the small table. In his gaze, she saw understanding. It was enough. From that day on, their silent language blossomed. Every action became a word, every gesture a sentence. They built their connection out of small, solid truths. A sudden thunderstorm rolled in one afternoon, the sky turning a bruised purple and the wind howling down the canyon walls. A loose shutter on the cabin's only window began to bang violently against the frame, the sound like a gunshot in the sudden gloom. Ellie jumped, her hand flying to her chest, a jolt of old fear coursing through her. Before she could even move to fix it, Wade was there. He strode to the window and with a few efficient movements, secured the shutter with a length of leather cord, silencing the alarming noise. He didn't look at her, didn't say, "It's all right." He simply stood for a moment, a solid, reassuring presence between her and the raging storm, his body a shield against the chaos. His actions spoke louder than any words of comfort. "I am here. I will keep you safe." At mealtimes, he would always ladle the stew, and he always served her first. It was a simple, almost unconscious gesture, but it was laden with meaning. He would stir the pot, ensuring the best pieces of meat and potato went into her bowl, which he would set before her without ceremony. It was the quiet, instinctual act of a provider, a protector. It was him saying, in his own way, that her well-being was his priority. He wasn't asking if she was hungry. He was ensuring she was nourished. Ellie learned to speak this language in return. She noticed the way he favored his left shoulder after a long day of chopping wood. That evening, she heated water over the fire and soaked a rag in it, and when he sat down, weary from his work, she simply placed the warm compress on his shoulder. He stiffened for a second, surprised, then slowly relaxed into the warmth. A low, almost inaudible sound, halfway between a sigh and a groan, escaped his lips. It was his way of saying thank you. Her gesture was her way of saying, "I see your pain, and I wish to ease it." She took over the mending completely. His shirts were worn, the fabric thin at the elbows, the seams strained across his broad back. She would take them while he was out, her small, neat stitches reinforcing the worn material. She patched a tear in his canvas duster, the one that had once hidden her from view, her needle moving with a focused reverence. She would fold the mended garment and leave it on his bedroll. He never mentioned it, but the next time he wore it, she would see him unconsciously run his thumb over her handiwork. He was acknowledging her care, her contribution to his life. Their silent conversation became a delicate, intricate dance. He would find a bird's nest that had fallen from a tree and leave it on the porch rail for Boone, but he would place it on the side where Ellie would see it first. She would find a patch of wild mint growing by the creek and brew a simple tea, leaving a cup for him on the table when he came in from the cold. He would notice her shivering on the porch one cool evening and return a moment later to drape a heavy wool blanket over her shoulders before retreating back into the cabin's warmth. She would notice his axe blade was dull and would find the sharpening stone, working at it until it held a keen edge once more. These were the small, sturdy bricks with which they were building their foundation. It was a foundation made not of grand declarations, but of the steady accumulation of quiet considerations. It was a language perfectly suited to them. Two people who had been so wounded by the world that they had retreated into silence, in the quiet of the valley. Through the language of unspoken kindness, they were slowly, carefully, learning to heal. They were discovering that the deepest affections were not always the ones that were spoken aloud, but the ones that were lived, moment by moment, in every bowl of stew served, every shutter secured against the storm, and every cup carved by hand and left on a sun-warmed stone. The peace of the valley was a fragile, precious thing, a thin pane of glass separating them from the harshness of the world. For weeks, that glass had held. But one late afternoon, as the sun began its descent and cast long, cool shadows across the meadow, the glass did not just crack, it shattered. It started with the horses. They grew agitated in the corral, their ears twitching, their heads held high as they stared intently at the narrow rock fissure that served as the valley's only entrance. Wade, who was reinforcing a loose post, went still. He placed his hammer down silently, his entire body a study in taut, listening stillness. Ellie, who was on the porch with Boone, showing him how to weave a small basket from creek reeds, felt a cold knot of dread tighten in her stomach. She had learned to read Wade's silence, and this was a silence she had not encountered before. It was the absolute, focused quiet of an animal that has scented a predator on the wind. "Boone!" Wade's voice was low, devoid of all warmth, a hard, flat stone of a sound. "Go inside. Take Ellie with you. Now!" Boone, who had never once questioned Wade, dropped his reeds and scrambled to his feet. His big, solemn eyes were wide with a fear he didn't understand, but instantly recognized in the man's tone. He grabbed Ellie's hand, his small fingers surprisingly strong, and pulled her toward the cabin door. "Wade, what is it?" Ellie whispered, her gaze fixed on his back. He didn't turn. "Inside," he repeated, his voice like the cocking of a hammer. She stumbled into the cabin, pulling Boone behind her, and shut the heavy wooden door. She peered through a small gap in the window shutter, her heart pounding a frantic, suffocating rhythm against her ribs. She saw Wade walk with a calm, deliberate stride to the woodpile. He didn't pick up the axe. Instead, he reached into a hollowed-out log she had never noticed before and pulled out a rifle. The fading sunlight glinted off the long, dark barrel. The sight of it made the danger terrifyingly real. He didn't have to wait long. 3 figures on horseback emerged from the fissure, their forms dark silhouettes against the bright western sky, even from a distance. Ellie recognized the lean, cruel posture of the leader. Finn, the hulking shape of Jeb, and the wiry, nervous energy of Roscoe followed close behind. They had found them. The impossible had happened. The sanctuary had been breached. They rode slowly into the center of the meadow, their eyes taking in the cabin, the corral, the impossible peace of the valley. A smug, triumphant smile spread across Finn's face. He had cornered his quarry. Wade did not hide. He stood in the open, the rifle held loosely at his side, his body positioned between the intruders and the cabin door. He was a lone, unmovable obstacle. "This is private land," he called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. It was not a plea, it was a warning. "Turn around." Finn chuckled. A dry, unpleasant sound. He swung down from his horse. "I don't think so. Friend, we tracked you for weeks. Waited till you made a run for supplies. You're a hard man to follow, but not impossible. We've come for what Mr. Blackwood paid for. We're not leaving without the girl." "There's no girl here for you," Wade said, his voice dropping even lower. becoming more dangerous. Is that right? Finn sneered. He took a step forward, his men dismounting behind him, their hands resting on the pistols at their belts. Let's just have a look inside that cabin and see for ourselves. You're not taking another step, Wade said. He raised the rifle, the movement fluid and economical, and settled the stock against his shoulder. Finn stopped. The smile vanished from his face, replaced by a cold, calculating glare. 3 of us, 1 of you, Cowboy. Those are bad odds. Only for you, Wade replied. The world seemed to hold its breath. Inside the cabin, Ellie held Boone tight against her, her hand covering his mouth to stifle any sound he might make. She could feel the boy's small body trembling. Through the shutter, she watched the terrible, silent standoff. It was Roscoe who broke the stalemate. Nerved up and impatient, he drew his pistol. Let's just shoot him and be done with it. The moment the pistol cleared leather, Wade fired. The rifle's report was a deafening crack that echoed off the canyon walls. It wasn't aimed at Roscoe's chest, but at his hand. The pistol flew from his grasp, and he shrieked in pain, clutching his bleeding fingers. Before the echo had even died, Jeb charged, letting out a bellow of rage. He ran low and fast, a human battering ram. Wade didn't have time to reload. He swung the heavy rifle like a club, catching Jeb in the side of the head. The big man grunted and stumbled, but his momentum carried him forward, and he crashed into Wade. The 2 men went down in a tangle of limbs. The rifle skittered away across the dusty ground. Finn drew his own pistol and ran to join the fray. The fight now a desperate, close-quarters brawl. It was brutal and chaotic. Wade was a force of nature, driven by a desperate need to protect the cabin behind him. He fought not with skill, but with a raw, savage strength. He got to his feet, throwing Jeb off him, and met Finn's advance with a punishing right cross that snapped the man's head back. Jeb came at him again from the side, and Wade drove an elbow into his throat, sending the big man gasping to his knees. But he was outnumbered. As he grappled with Jeb, Finn recovered. He didn't try to trade punches again. Instead, he reversed his pistol and, with a vicious 2-handed swing, brought the heavy steel butt down on the back of Wade's head. The sound was a sickening, wet crunch. Wade's eyes went wide for a split second, a look of stunned surprise on his face. His body went slack. He crumpled to the ground and lay still, a dark stain beginning to spread in his hair. No! The scream was torn from Ellie's throat before she could stop it. The sound betrayed her presence, but she didn't care. All she could see was Wade's still form, a fallen giant in the dust. Finn looked up, his chest heaving, a cruel, triumphant grin on his bruised face. Well, the little bird wants to sing. He kicked Wade's unmoving body, a gesture of pure contempt. Get in there and drag her out, he snarled at Jeb. Jeb, nursing his throat, staggered toward the cabin. He threw his massive shoulder against the door. The wood groaned, the bar holding it straining. He hit it again, and the bar splintered with a loud crack. The door flew open. Ellie stumbled back, pulling Boone behind her. Jeb filled the doorway, his face a mask of sweaty, brutish determination. His eyes fixed on her. Come on, little lady, party's over. He took a step inside, but as he reached for her, Boone, in a fit of desperate, childish courage, launched himself forward and bit the big man's hand as hard as he could. Jeb roared in pain and surprise, shaking the boy off like he was a pesky dog. Why, you little rat, he snarled. Before Ellie could react, he snatched Boone up, his huge hand clamping around the boy's small chest. He lifted him off the ground, holding him like a shield. Boone kicked and struggled, his face pale with terror. That's enough, Jeb yelled, his voice echoing in the small cabin. He pulled a long, wicked-looking knife from his belt and held the blade to Boone's throat. The boy froze, his eyes wide with pure, uncomprehending horror. One more move. Girl, and the kid gets it. Now you're going to walk out of here nice and easy. Ellie's world dissolved into a roaring tunnel of terror. Everything she had run from, everything she had feared, was here. But it was worse now, 1,000 times worse, because it was not just her life on the line. They were going to hurt Boone. They were going to hurt this small, silent boy who had shared his home and his heart with her. Something inside her broke. The fear was still there. A cold, sickening wave. But something else rose through it. It was a white-hot, protective rage. The girl who had hidden under a coat, who had cowered in the shadows, was gone. Her eyes darted around the room and found what she was looking for, Wade's old shotgun. It was mounted on 2 wooden pegs over the hearth, where he kept it clean but unloaded. Below it, on the mantelpiece, was a small, leather pouch of shells. Her movements were clumsy, jerky with adrenaline. "Don't come any closer," she warned, her voice a trembling, reedy thing. Jeb laughed. "Or what you gonna cry on me?" She scrambled onto a stool, her hands shaking so badly she could barely unhook the heavy weapon. It was heavier than she could have imagined. She nearly dropped it. Jeb took another slow, confident step into the room. She fumbled with the pouch on the mantelpiece, her fingers feeling like numb, useless things. She managed to pull out 2 heavy brass shells. Her mind was a frantic blur, trying to remember how she had seen Wade load it once, long ago. She broke the barrel open, the mechanism stiff and unfamiliar. She pushed the shells into the chambers and snapped it shut. The click of the metal locking into place was the loudest sound she had ever heard. She turned, lifting the heavy shotgun. The stock was awkward against her small shoulder, the long barrels wavering in her trembling hands. She aimed it squarely at Jeb's chest. The laughter died on the big man's face. He stopped, his eyes widening at the sight of the twin black barrels pointed at him. The knife at Boone's throat did not waver, but the confidence in his stance was gone. "You don't have the nerve," he said, but his voice had lost its conviction. "Let him go," Ellie said. Her voice was still shaking, but there was a core of hard, unyielding steel in it now. "Let him go, or I swear I will shoot you. I don't care what happens to me after." She meant it. In that moment, her own life had ceased to matter. All that mattered was the small, terrified child in the grip of this monster. It was a standoff, a terrified girl who had never fired a gun, and a brute holding a knife to a child's throat. Outside, Finn watched, a flicker of unease crossing his face. This was getting complicated. Then, from the direction of the canyon entrance, came a new sound. It was the slow, steady clopping of a single horse. A man rode into the valley. He was old, his face a roadmap of wrinkles carved by decades of sun and sorrow. He sat atop a tired-looking mule, a tattered serape draped over his shoulders. He looked like a poor farmer, a man of no consequence. Finn dismissed him with a glance. "Get out of here, old man. He's Snarpalco, his pistol still in his hand. This is none of your concern." The old man, Raoul, slid off his mule. He did not look at Finn. His dark, mournful eyes were fixed on the still form of Wade Carrigan lying in the dust. A look of profound, heart-wrenching pain crossed his face. Then his gaze lifted to the cabin, to the terrible tableau within. "I think," Raoul said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, "that anything that happens in this valley is my concern." With a movement that was shockingly fast for a man his age, he reached back to his mule and pulled a double-barreled shotgun from a scabbard on the saddle. It was old and battered, its stock dark with age, but it was a fearsome-looking weapon. He cocked both hammers, the twin clicks sharp and final in the tense silence. He leveled the gun not at Finn, but at Roscoe, who was still cradling his injured hand. "Drop your gun belt, muchacho." Slowly. Roscoe, his face pale with pain and fear, did as he was told. Raoul's dark eyes then settled on Finn. "Tell your friend to let the boy go. Tell him to do it now, or I will send this one to his maker, and then I will see about you." There was no bluff in the old man's voice. There was only the cold, hard certainty of a man who had seen too much death to be afraid of it any longer. Finn stared at the twin barrels of the shotgun, then at the wild, desperate look in Ellie's eyes inside the cabin. His simple retrieval mission had turned into a potential bloodbath. He was a bully and a thug, but he was not a fool. Silas Blackwood didn't pay him enough to die here. "Jeb!" he called out, his voice tight with frustration. "Let the kid go. It's over." Jeb hesitated, his face contorted with rage, but he saw the resolve in Ellie's face, and he heard the deadly promise in the old man's voice. With a curse, he shoved Boone away from him. The boy stumbled and fell, then scrambled on all fours toward Ellie. She never lowered the shotgun, not until Jeb had backed out of the cabin and he, Finn, and Roscoe had mounted their horses. "This ain't over," Finn spat, his face dark with fury and humiliation. "Blackwood will hear about this." They spurred their horses and galloped out of the valley, disappearing into the fissure like the evil spirits they were. They were gone. The immediate danger had passed. The shotgun suddenly felt impossibly heavy in Ellie's arms. It slipped from her grasp and clattered to the floor. Her legs gave out, and she sank down. Pulling Boone into a fierce, sobbing embrace, Raoul walked slowly to where Wade lay. He knelt, his old joints protesting, and gently felt for a pulse in Wade's neck. He looked up at the cabin, his ancient face a mask of grief and worry. "He is alive," he called out, his voice heavy, "but he is hurt bad." Ellie looked up from Boone's tangled hair. Through the open cabin door, she could see Wade. He was lying utterly, terrifyingly still on the ground, a dark pool spreading in the red dust beneath his head. The intruders were gone, but the battle was far from over. The echoes of the gunshots faded, replaced by a silence that was heavier and more terrifying than the violence that had preceded it. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to stop. Ellie remained on the floor, her arms wrapped around Boone's trembling body, her own heart a frantic, trapped bird against her ribs. Then Raoul's voice, heavy with a terrible urgency, cut through her paralysis. "He is alive, but he is hurt bad." That was all it took. The fragile, terrified girl was gone, replaced by a woman forged in the crucible of that afternoon's terror. She gently pushed Boone toward the old man, who had entered the cabin, his ancient face grim. "Stay with Raoul. Boone, be brave." She ran outside, her feet stumbling in the dust, and fell to her knees beside Wade. The sight of him stole the air from her lungs. He was so utterly still. The vibrant, powerful energy that always surrounded him, even in his quietest moments, was gone. He was just a man, broken and bleeding into the red earth of the valley he had made his fortress. The back of his head was a matted, bloody mess, the gash deep and ugly. "We must get him inside," Raoul said, his voice a low rumble beside her. "Now, before the cold sets in." Together, they performed the Herculean task. Raoul, though old, possessed a wiry strength, and Ellie was fueled by a desperate, adrenaline-fed power she didn't know she had. They half-lifted, half-dragged Wade's dead weight across the porch and into the cabin, leaving a dark, terrible trail in the dust. They managed to get him onto his own rope bed, the one she had been using for weeks. He lay there, his face ashen under its streaks of dirt and blood, his breathing a shallow, ragged whisper. The next hours were a blur of desperate, focused activity. The cabin, once a haven of peace, became a field hospital. Raoul, it turned out, was a man of hidden knowledge. He had spent a lifetime in these harsh lands and knew their secrets. He sent Ellie to the creek for fresh water, then to the small herb patch he cultivated in a hidden corner of the valley. He gave her instructions in a low, steady voice that was a lifeline in her sea of panic. Yarrow to stop the bleeding, willow bark, crushed for the fever that will come, clean rags, all you can find. While she worked, he tended to the wound itself. He gently cut away the matted hair, his gnarled fingers surprisingly steady. He cleaned the gash with a practiced, methodical care that spoke of a grim familiarity with such injuries. Ellie returned with the herbs and watched as he packed the wound with a poultice of crushed yarrow leaves, his lips moving in a silent, prayer-like murmur. He then bound Wade's head with strips of a clean linen sheet she had torn, the white fabric a stark, shocking contrast to the dark, spreading stain of blood. Boone never left the cabin. He sat on the small stool by the hearth, his carving knife and piece of wood lying forgotten in his lap. He was a small, silent statue of shock, his huge, dark eyes fixed on the unmoving figure on the bed. He watched everything, his face pale, his small body rigid with a terror he could not articulate. Night fell. Raoul built up the fire, casting a warm, flickering light that did little to dispel the cold dread in the room. He made a thin broth, forcing both Ellie and Boone to drink some. Then he looked at Ellie, his old, sad eyes filled with a weary honesty. "I have done what I can," he said softly. "The rest is in God's hands. And yours. He will have a fever. You must keep him cool. Try to get some of this broth into him if you can. And you must talk to him. Sometimes, the spirit needs a voice to follow, to find its way back from the darkness." The old man settled into a chair by the fire, his shotgun resting across his knees, a silent, weary sentinel. He knew that the danger might not be over, that Finn and his men might return, but Ellie's world had shrunk to the space beside the rope bed. She pulled a chair close, took a clean rag, and dipped it in a bowl of cool water. And so the long vigil began. The first night was the worst. The fever came, just as Raoul had predicted, a dry, consuming heat that radiated from Wade's skin. He began to mutter, his words a senseless, tortured jumble from a life she knew nothing about, names she didn't recognize, places she had never heard of. He tossed his head back and forth on the pillow, his body racked with tremors. Ellie fought the fever with a fierce, relentless devotion. She bathed his face and neck with the cool, damp cloth. She talked to him, her voice a low, steady murmur in the dark. "Quiet room. It's all right. Wade, you're safe. You're home. The fever will pass. You just have to fight." She spoke as if to convince herself as much as him. The hours bled into one another, marked only by the sputtering of the fire and the changing of the rags. Boone fell asleep on his stool, his small head slumped against his chest. But Ellie did not feel a trace of exhaustion. Her entire being was focused on the man in the bed, on the shallow, labored rise and fall of his chest. The next day was the same, and the day after that. The valley outside continued its life. The sun rose, flooding the meadow with light. The creek continued its endless, murmuring journey. But inside the cabin, time was suspended. Life was measured in breaths. Raoul would come and go, tending to the horses, checking the perimeter of their fortress. But he was a background figure. The world had become this small, fire-lit room, and the two silent figures within it, a small boy who refused to leave his post, and a young woman who refused to give up hope. Ellie's monologue became a constant, flowing stream. She had no books to read from, so she read to him from the pages of their short life together. She told him about the day, about the color of the sky, about the two hawks she saw circling the high cliffs. "Boone is carving a horse," she whispered, her voice growing hoarse. "He's getting quite good. He wants to show you when you wake up. The horses, Valor and Dust, they miss you. They keep looking toward the cabin. They know you're not right." She told him stories of her own childhood, small, insignificant memories of her mother, of a favorite dress, of the smell of baking bread. She filled the silence with the sound of her voice, trying to build a bridge of words that he could cross to come back to them. "You made me a cup," she told him one afternoon, her fingers tracing the rim of the wooden cup which she now kept constantly filled with fresh water by the bed. "It's the most beautiful thing I have ever owned. I keep it right here. It's waiting for you." She tried to get the broth into him. She would lift his head with one hand, her arm trembling from the effort, and patiently spoon the thin liquid between his lips with the other. Most of it dribbled out, but sometimes a swallow would work its way down his throat, and she would count it as a victory. She held his hand. It was large and calloused, the hand of a man who worked and fought, but in his unconsciousness, it was limp and lifeless. She would wrap her smaller, softer hands around it, as if she could pour her own strength, her own will to live, directly into him through her touch. On the fourth day, the fever broke. She awoke from a brief, fitful doze in her chair to find his skin cool and damp to the touch. The violent tossing had ceased. His breathing was still shallow, but it was deeper, more regular. A fragile, terrifying hope began to flutter in her chest. She sat with him all day, watching, waiting. The stillness in the room was different now. It was no longer the stillness of a crisis, but the expectant quiet of a deep, healing sleep. That evening, as the last rays of sun painted the cabin walls in strokes of gold, his eyelids flickered. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. She leaned closer, her heart hammering. "Wade," she whispered. "Wade, can you hear me?" His eyelids flickered again, a slow, sluggish movement. Then, with an effort that seemed to take all the strength he possessed, he opened his eyes. They were clouded and unfocused at first, struggling to make sense of the shadowy room. They roamed vaguely before they finally found her face. They stared at her for a long, silent moment, and a flicker of recognition, of consciousness, returned to their stormy gray depths. His lips moved, but no sound came out. He tried again. A dry, rasping sound emerged, a voice she barely recognized. "You're still here." The words were a question, but they were also a statement of profound, weary wonder. He had gone into the darkness, and when he returned, she was the first thing he saw. A sob, a great wrenching sound of relief and joy, escaped Ellie's throat. Tears she hadn't even realized she was holding back began to stream down her face. She smiled through them, a watery, brilliant smile that felt like the sun coming out after a long and terrible storm. "Still here," she whispered back, her voice choked with emotion. His gaze held hers, and for the first time the walls he kept around himself, the weary distance in his eyes, seemed to crumble. There was a raw vulnerability there, a silent acknowledgement of the battle he had fought and the person who had seen him through it. Slowly, with a trembling, deliberate effort, he lifted his hand from the blanket. It was not the limp, lifeless hand she had been holding for days. There was purpose in it now. He reached for her. She met his hand with her own. His fingers, still weak, closed around hers. The grip was not strong, but it was definite. It was slow. It was gentle, but it was firm. It was the first time he had truly touched her. Not in desperation, not in chaos, but with a quiet, conscious intent. It was a thank you. It was a promise. It was an anchor. A solid, tangible connection in the quiet, fire-lit cabin. A silent testament that he had crossed the bridge she had built for him and had come back home. Wade's return from the edge of death was a slow, arduous journey. But it was a journey they took together. The first week was marked by his profound weakness, his long stretches of sleep, and his silent, watchful presence when he was awake. The cabin remained a quiet, hushed space, but the oppressive air of crisis had lifted, replaced by the gentle, focused hum of recovery. Ellie was his constant shadow, her life revolving around his needs. She would help him sit up, spooning broth into his mouth, no longer fighting his unconsciousness, but nourishing his returning strength. Raoul stayed for that first week, a quiet, reassuring presence. He was the bridge to the outside world they had forgotten, his knowledge a bedrock on which they could rebuild. He and Ellie worked together to repair the damage. They found a sturdy piece of seasoned oak and, under Wade's quiet direction from the doorway, fashioned a new, stronger bar for the door. They replaced the splintered wood of the frame. Every nail hammered into place felt like an act of defiance, a statement that this home, this sanctuary, would not be so easily broken again. When Raoul finally prepared to leave, he took Ellie aside. His old, wrinkled face was serious. "Blackwood is not a man who forgives," he said, his voice a low rumble. "But he is a man who understands profit and loss. For now, the cost of coming back here is too high. You are safe for a time, but you must be watchful." He looked toward Wade, who was sitting on the porch steps for the first time, his face pale in the morning light. "He will protect you. It is his nature. But you brought him back. Do not forget the strength you have, little bird." With a final, solemn nod, the old man mounted his mule and disappeared back through the fissure, leaving the three of them alone once more in their secluded world. His departure marked a turning point. Summer arrived in earnest, and with it came a profound shift in the valley's spirit. The sun was warmer, the days longer. The creek, fed by the last of the mountain snowmelt, ran higher and faster, its voice a constant, cheerful murmur. The meadow exploded into a riot of green, dotted with the gold of black-eyed Susans and the purple of lupine. The valley was not just healing, it was thriving, and so were they. The first sound to truly return was Boone's laughter, as Wade grew stronger, moving from the porch to the corral, then to the woodpile. The oppressive weight on the boy's small shoulders finally lifted. The silent, watchful child who had stood vigil by the fire began to disappear, replaced by a boy full of life. His laughter, when it first rang out a pure, delighted shriek as he chased a grasshopper through the tall grass, startled them both. Ellie looked up from the beans she was shelling on the porch, and her eyes met Wade's across the yard. He was leaning on his axe, his strength not yet fully returned, and the ghost of a smile touched his lips. It was the most beautiful sound in the world. Their lives settled into a new kind of normal, a routine built not just for survival, but for living. The division of labor was unspoken and absolute. Wade, his strength returning with each passing day, took on the heavy work of the homestead. He mended the sections of fence that had grown weak over the winter. He cleared the garden plot, his shovel turning the dark, rich earth. He retarred the cabin roof, ensuring it was sound and watertight. His movements were still deliberate, but the weary slowness was gone, replaced by a returning, formidable power. Ellie claimed the domestic world as her own. The cabin became a true home under her touch. She learned the quirks of the hearth, how to coax a slow, steady heat for baking. The smell of fresh bread began to fill the small space, a warm, comforting scent that spoke of permanence. She scrubbed the floorboards until they were pale and clean. She found a patch of wild berries and made a small batch of jam, its sweetness a rare and precious luxury. She was no longer just a refugee earning her keep. She was the heart of their home, the quiet center around which their lives revolved. They moved around each other in a seamless, silent ballet. She would rise before the sun to boil the water for his coffee, and she would find a neat stack of kindling he had left for her by the hearth the night before. He would come in from a long morning of work to find his shirt, which had been torn on a branch, already mended with her small, neat stitches and laid out on the bed. They were two parts of a single, functioning whole. Their efforts intertwined, their lives inextricably linked. The silent language between them deepened, growing richer and more nuanced. The grand gestures of survival were replaced by the small, tender currencies of daily affection. Every action was a declaration of care. One sweltering afternoon, Wade was out in the full sun, resetting a heavy corner post of the corral. It was back-breaking work, and the sweat poured from him, soaking his shirt. Ellie watched him from the shade of the porch. She disappeared into the cabin and returned a few moments later with her wooden cup, filled to the brim with the coldest water from the depths of the creek. She walked out to the fence line. He didn't see her approach. his focus entirely on his work. She didn't call out his name. She simply placed the cup on the flat top of a nearby post, in the small patch of shade cast by a cottonwood, and walked back to the cabin. A few minutes later, she saw him straighten up, wiping his brow with the back of his arm. He saw the cup. He stopped, looking at it for a long moment before picking it up and draining it in one long swallow. He didn't look toward the cabin, didn't acknowledge her, but when he went back to work, his movements seemed lighter, his efforts renewed. Her simple act was a silent message. I am thinking of you. I see your labor. Let me offer you this small comfort. He spoke the language in return. Game was scarce, but one evening he returned with 2 rabbits. It was the first fresh meat they had had in weeks. The stew that night was rich and fragrant. When he ladled it out, he bypassed his own bowl and Boone's, and first served Ellie. He made sure the choicest, most tender pieces of meat went into her bowl, leaving the leaner parts for himself. It was a gesture so quiet, so instinctual, it was almost invisible. But Ellie saw it. In a world where every mouthful of food was a victory, he gave her the best of what he had. It was his way of saying, your well-being comes first. You are precious. Wade found himself watching her constantly. He would be splitting logs, the rhythm of the axe a familiar comfort, and his gaze would drift to the cabin. He'd see her hanging laundry on the line he had strung between 2 trees, her form framed by the clean white sheets billowing in the breeze, her hair coming loose from its braid and catching the golden afternoon light. He would watch her with Boone, her head bent close to his as she patiently taught him his letters, scratching them in the dirt with a stick. He saw a gentleness and a resilience in her that humbled him. She had come to his valley as a frightened girl, a bird with a broken wing. But she was not broken. She was the strongest person he had ever known. She had faced down armed men. She had pulled him back from the grave, and now she was turning his lonely, silent shelter into a place of warmth and laughter. The feelings that rose in him when he watched her were unfamiliar and unsettling. A warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the summer sun. Their physical world was small, and they were often in close proximity. A constant, low-grade awareness of each other's presence humming in the air between them. The doorway of the cabin was narrow. When he would come in from outside and she would be heading out to the creek, they would have to turn sideways to pass. In those moments, her arm would brush his. Her hip would graze his thigh. The brief, accidental contact was like a spark, a sudden jolt of electricity that left a tingling warmth in its wake. They would never acknowledge it, their eyes fixed straight ahead, but the air would thicken, charged with everything they couldn't say. One evening, a cool breeze came up after dinner. Wade was outside, checking on the horses. Ellie was inside, about to bar the door for the night. She saw him through the opening, a tall, solitary figure standing by the corral, his face turned up to the star-dusted sky. He looked lonely, she thought, like a man still carrying the weight of a world of sorrows. On impulse, she took the heavy wool blanket from her own bed. She didn't go all the way outside. She stood in the doorway, the door pulled halfway shut, a barrier between the warm, safe light of the cabin and the vast, cool darkness of the night. "Wade," she said, her voice soft. He turned, his expression unreadable in the gloom. She held the blanket out through the gap in the doorway. "It's getting cold." He walked toward her, his boots silent in the soft dust. He stopped just on the other side of the door, so close she could feel the faint warmth radiating from his body. He didn't take the blanket immediately. Instead, he reached through the opening and took her hand, the one that wasn't holding the blanket. His fingers closed around hers. His palm was rough and calloused, but his grip was gentle. It was not the brief, urgent touch of their escape, nor the weak, trembling hold of his recovery. This was a deliberate, conscious act of connection. He simply held her hand, his thumb stroking softly across her knuckles. They stood like that for a long, silent moment, separated by the physical barrier of the door, but more connected than they had ever been. The world seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them in the quiet darkness. His hand holding hers. It was a vow made without words, a promise sealed in a simple, profound touch. It was not the grand, public declaration of a love story told in books. It was the quiet, sturdy, undeniable truth of their own. In the stillness of the valley, love had not come in a rush of passion, but had grown slowly, patiently, like a tree, its roots reaching deep into the shared soil of their quiet, everyday lives. He finally took the blanket from her, his fingers brushing hers one last time, and the look that passed between them in the shadows held everything that words ever could. The quiet understanding that had grown between them was as tangible as the solid log walls of the cabin. It was in the air they breathed, in the shared space of the small room, in the comfortable silence that no longer needed to be filled. The touch of his hand through the doorway had been a threshold crossed, a silent question asked and answered. But a heart, once broken, learns to crave certainty. Ellie's newfound peace was a beautiful, sun-drenched meadow, but in the far corners of her mind, the dark shadows of her past still lingered. She was safe, she was cared for, but the word forever was a ghost she did not dare to summon. Summer reached its zenith. The days were long and hot, the nights warm and scented with pine and the sweet perfume of night-blooming flowers. The valley was heavy with life, buzzing with the drone of bees and the lazy chirping of crickets. It was a world teeming with permanence, with a steady, reliable cycle of growth and bloom. It made Ellie feel both perfectly at home and achingly temporary. She was a wildflower transplanted into this secret garden, but wildflowers, by their nature, are fleeting. One afternoon, she wandered farther than usual. Following the creek as it curved around a high wall of rock, there, in a secluded, sun-drenched clearing, was a field she hadn't seen before. It was a breathtaking tapestry of Indian paintbrush, their fiery red tips like flames licking at the sky, and brilliant yellow sunflowers, their heavy heads turned in unison toward the afternoon sun. It was a place of audacious, unapologetic beauty. It was in one of these sunflowers that she saw the valley's spirit, and her own. It was not delicate or shy like the bluebell she had picked weeks ago. It was strong, its stalk thick and sturdy, its face open and bold, its color the very essence of sunlight and hope. It had fought its way out of the same hard, rocky soil as everything else, and it did not apologize for its brilliance. She remembered the girl who had picked the bluebell. That girl had been fragile, her hope a tiny, secret thing she had left on a windowsill like a prayer. She was not that girl anymore. The woman she was becoming did not hope in whispers. With a steady hand, she broke the thick stalk of a single, perfect sunflower and carried it back to the cabin. It felt heavy and substantial in her hand, a golden scepter of her own choosing. She did not place it on the windowsill. This time, she laid it directly on the threshold of the open cabin door, its bright face turned inward, a bold and unambiguous invitation, a statement. I am here. My roots are in this soil now. She went about her evening tasks, her heart a steady, calm drum in her chest. She was not anxious. She was not fearful. She had laid her truth on the doorstep, and she would trust him to receive it. Later that night, long after Boone had fallen asleep and the cabin was filled with the soft glow of a single lantern, she saw him. He was sitting at the table, the place where they shared their silent meals. In front of him was the worn, leather-bound journal. He picked up the sunflower from where he had brought it inside. It was too large, too substantial to be pressed whole, with a careful, almost surgical precision. He gently detached a single, perfect golden petal. He opened the journal. Ellie moved silently to the shadows near the hearth, where she could see. He turned to the page where the small, faded bluebell rested. The delicate flower, once a vibrant blue, was now a pale, paper-thin memory of what it had been. It looked fragile, a ghost of a hopeful moment. With the utmost care, He laid the single and golden sunflower petal beside it. The contrast was breathtaking. The pale, timid hope of the past, lying next to the bold, brilliant gold of the present. It was their story, written on a single page in the language of flowers. He looked at the two tokens for a long time, his expression softened by the lantern light, a look of profound, quiet contemplation on his face. He then closed the journal, the story of their silent love now holding a new chapter within its pages. He did not put the journal away immediately. He just sat there, his hand resting on the worn leather cover. He knew she was awake. He knew she was watching. The silence in the room was no longer just an absence of sound. It was alive, a palpable presence that connected them across the dark room. He stood up, placed the journal back on the mantelpiece, and turned to face her. His gray eyes, so often stormy or distant, were clear and deep. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod toward the open door, toward the moon-drenched valley outside. It was an invitation. Her heart leaped. She walked toward him, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. They stepped out onto the porch together, into the cool night air. The moon was a perfect silver coin in a sea of glittering stars. The air was sweet with the scent of the meadow. He didn't speak. He simply started walking, not toward the creek or the corral, but toward the open meadow, toward the place where the wildflowers grew thickest. She walked beside him, their shoulders almost touching. The world felt brand new, a secret kingdom that belonged only to the two of them. They stopped in the heart of the meadow, surrounded by the dark, sleeping shapes of the flowers. This was the place she had first seen when she had stumbled out of the rocky passage, a place that had promised an impossible safety. She had been a runaway then, a hunted thing seeking only a place to hide. She looked around now, at the vast, starry sky above, at the sturdy, silent man beside her, at the beautiful, resilient life growing all around them. She was not hiding anymore. She was found. She felt a profound, overwhelming sense of having been chosen. Wade had not just given her shelter. He had given her a place in his world. He had fought for her, tended to her, and with his silent, steady care, he had allowed her to grow. In this valley, she had not just been kept safe. She had been kept. The emotions were too powerful to be held in silence any longer. The words rose in her throat, not with the desperation of her first plea on the train, but with the quiet, unshakable certainty of a truth that had finally taken root. She turned to him, her face illuminated by the soft moonlight. "Wade," she began, her voice a near whisper, yet it carried clearly in the still night air. At first, all I asked was to hide under your coat." She looked down for a moment, remembering the terror, the darkness, the feeling of his solid warmth beside her. She looked back up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Now all I want is to stand beside you for the rest of my life." The words hung in the air between them, a fragile and beautiful confession. It was everything she had, her whole heart, laid bare at his feet. He didn't answer right away. He just looked at her, his expression intense, his gray eyes searching her face as if memorizing it. She saw a storm of emotions there that he would never speak aloud, the memory of his own past losses, the fear of a future he hadn't dared to imagine, and something else, something powerful and new and aimed entirely at her. He did not say, "I love you." He did not make a grand promise. He was a man of action, and his answer would be one as well. Slowly, deliberately, he bent down. He untied the laces of one of his heavy, scuffed boots, the ones that had carried him through deserts and across mountains, the boots of a man always ready to move on. He pulled it off and set it on the ground. Then he did the same with the other. He stood up, barefoot in the cool, soft grass of the meadow. He took a step toward her, the earth yielding slightly under his weight. He was no longer a traveler passing through. He was planting himself here, in this soil, in this life, with her. He looked down at her, the ghost of a smile. The rare, true smile that reached his eyes touching his lips. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low, gravelly rumble. A challenge that was the most profound and binding vow he could possibly make. "Try and make me leave." Wade's words, a low challenge spoken into the vast, moonlit silence of the meadow, were the heaviest, most solid things Ellie had ever heard. "Try and make me leave." It was not a promise spoken on a Bible, not a vow sworn before witnesses. It was something far more real. It was a shifting of the very ground beneath their feet, a declaration that his wandering was over, that his roots, like the stubborn wildflowers all around them, were now irrevocably tangled in the soil of this hidden valley. With her. She didn't answer with words. There were no words that could meet the profound gravity of that moment. Instead, she took a single step forward, closing the small space between them. She reached up and laid her hand on his chest, right over his heart, beneath her palm. She could feel its steady, powerful beat, a rhythm that had become the baseline of her own life. It was a heart that had been still for too long, and she had helped it remember how to beat for someone other than himself. He placed his own hand over hers, his rough, warm fingers enveloping her own, pressing them gently against him. They stood like that for a long time, two solitary figures who had found their center in each other. The silence of the meadow filled with the truth of everything they had become. The past was a ghost, a fading story. The future was an unknown country. But the present, this single, perfect moment, was a fortress. Life after that night was, on the surface, unchanged. The sun still rose over the eastern cliffs. The creek still murmured its endless song, and the days were still filled with the simple, demanding tasks of homesteading. But everything was different. The unspoken understanding between them had been given a voice, not in a flood of conversation, but in a new and profound certainty that underscored every shared glance, every quiet gesture. The question had been answered. They were staying. They were together. The physical evidence of their battle with the outside world healed and faded. The scar on the back of Wade's head disappeared into his thick, dark hair, becoming a hidden ridge only she knew was there. The last of the tenderness in her ankle vanished, leaving her with a stride that was sure and confident on the valley's uneven ground. The new bar on the cabin door, fashioned from sturdy oak, was a testament to their resilience. The breach had been mended. Their world was secure once more. The change was most evident in Wade. The deep, weary sadness that had been a permanent fixture in his gray eyes began to recede. It was not gone entirely, the wounds of his past were too deep for that, but it was no longer the defining feature of his gaze. He began to look at the world around him not as a place to endure, but as a place to live. He watched the hawks circle overhead not with a distant emptiness, but with a quiet appreciation. He listened to Boone's childish chatter not with mere tolerance, but with a genuine, gentle amusement. And he looked at Ellie. He looked at her in a way that made her feel more seen, more cherished than she had ever thought possible. His gaze would follow her as she moved about the cabin, a silent, steady warmth that was as comforting as the morning sun. He would watch her hands as she kneaded dough, her brow furrowed in concentration, and a look of quiet wonder would cross his face. The walls he had built around his heart had not been torn down in a violent storm. They had been slowly, patiently weathered away by her gentle, persistent presence, until the light could finally shine through. Ellie, in turn, bloomed. The hunted, fearful girl who had scrambled aboard a freight train was a distant memory. She moved through the valley with a sense of ownership, of belonging. This was her home. These were her people. She was no longer running from a life that had been chosen for her. She was building a life of her own choosing. Her laughter became a frequent sound, mingling with Boone's, a melody that filled the once silent corners of the cabin. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a creator of meals, of comfort, of a home. Their silent language of affection continued, but it was bolder now. imbued with the confidence of their shared commitment. He would come back from checking a line of traps and find her by the creek, and he would stand beside her, his shoulder brushing hers, as they watched the water flow by. The shared silence, a comfortable, intimate embrace. She would be mending a shirt by the firelight, and he would come and sit on the stool beside her, not to speak, but simply to be in her presence, to share her space. The small table in the center of the room, once a place of silent, solitary meals, became the heart of their world. The stew was still simple, the bread still coarse, but the meals were seasoned with a new ingredient: joy. Boone would recount his day's adventures, the lizard he had almost caught, the strange, shiny rock he had found, and Wade would listen, asking a quiet question here and there, a small smile playing on his lips. Ellie would watch them, her heart so full it felt as though it might burst. The simple act of sharing a meal, a thing she had once taken for granted, now felt like the most sacred of rituals. It was during one of these meals, as the sun set and filled the cabin with a warm, rosy light, that Boone asked the question. He had been looking back and forth between Wade and Ellie, his small, serious face full of a child's simple, profound curiosity. He was trying to fit the pieces of his world together, to find the words for the feeling that now filled their home. He looked at Wade, then at Ellie, who was pushing a stray piece of hair from her face, a small smile on her lips as she listened to the boy's story. He then looked back at Wade, his head tilted. "Are you two a family?" The question was so direct, so innocent, it seemed to hang in the air for a moment, absorbing all the light and sound in the room. It was the question that lay unspoken beneath every shared task, every quiet glance, every gentle touch. It was the question Ellie had held in her own heart, the one she had not dared to ask aloud. Wade did not answer immediately. He stopped with his spoon halfway to his mouth. He slowly lowered it back to his bowl. Then he turned his head and looked at Ellie. It was a look that contained everything. It held the memory of a rattling boxcar, of a desperate flight through the desert, of a vigil kept by a fire, of a flower pressed in a book, of a hand held through a doorway. It was a look of gratitude, of wonder, of a deep and abiding love that had grown in the most unlikely of places. All the walls were gone from his eyes. There was no more shadow, no more distance. There was only her. And then he smiled. It was not the ghost of a smile she had seen before, not the faint, fleeting upward turn of his lips. This was a full, genuine, transformative smile. It reached his stormy gray eyes and lit them from within, chasing away the last of the shadows. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated happiness, a smile she had never imagined she would see on his face. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. He kept his eyes on her as he answered the boy, his voice a low, steady rumble that was as solid and certain as the mountains that sheltered them. "Yeah," he said, the smile never leaving his face. "We're a family now." The words settled over the small cabin. A benediction, family. It was not a word defined by blood or by law, but by the stubborn, resilient bonds of love and loyalty forged in the fire of shared hardship and the quiet comfort of shared lives. Ellie felt the last of her old fears dissolve into nothingness, washed away by the simple, powerful truth of that single word. She was no longer the girl who was running. Wade was no longer the man who was hiding, and Boone was no longer the boy who was alone. They were a family, a small, unlikely constellation of souls who had found their home in each other, a testament to the fact that even in the harshest, most unforgiving of lands, love, like a wildflower, could find a way to grow. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to hear from you, so please comment below and let us know where in the world you're listening from. Let's connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And to help this story reach even more listeners, please support us by hitting the hype button. Your support means the world to us.